Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Murphy. I'm the Interim Associate Director here at the Alice Paul Center at Penn. And I would like to begin our event today with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement, for anyone who may not be familiar with the practice, often takes place at the beginning of lectures, ceremonies, and public events such as this keynote talk. To acknowledge is one small way to show respect to Indigenous peoples and their enduring connection with their traditional territories and its histories. In an effort to recognize both the historical and ongoing practices of colonization, we wish to affirm that the Alice Paul Center and program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pennsylvania occupies the traditional, unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We wish to acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together in this community that, while virtual today, is based out of Philadelphia. Our year at the center, dedicated to environmental feminisms, is part of an ongoing effort to recognize our own individual and institutional place in settler colonialism, and to better understand and support the relationship between Indigenous knowledges, climate activism, and relations with and within the environment broadly conceived by engaging these ideas alongside other environmental feminist work more broadly throughout the year. Thank you. Today, it's my honor to introduce the second keynote speaker for Beyond Survival, Eco-Feminist Imaginings in Precarious Times. With generous support from the University Research Foundation, the School of Arts and Sciences, and Native American and Indigenous Studies at Penn, this week's events are intended to address environmental feminism through a broad range of perspectives and methods. Tonight, we welcome Kim TallBear. Kim TallBear is an associate professor in the Faculty of Age Studies at the University of Alberta, and she is Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and Environment. She is also a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow. Dr. TallBear is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. Building on her research on the role of technoscience in settler colonialism, Dr. TallBear also studies the colonization of Indigenous sexuality. She is a regular commentator in US, Canadian, and UK media outlets on issues related to Indigenous peoples, science and technology, as well as Indigenous sexualities. She's a regular panelist on the weekly podcast Media Indigena. She is a citizen of the Siston, Wampton, Oyate in South Dakota. And we are also very lucky to be joined by two discussants today. Dr. Marge M. Brujac is an associate professor of anthropology, associate faculty in the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and the coordinator of Native American and Indigenous Studies here at Penn. In her multimodal career as a performer, ethnographer, historian, and museum consultant, Brujac has long been committed to critical studies of colonial histories, archives, and museums. At Penn, Dr. Brujac directs a restorative research project, the Wampum Trail, that tracks the circulation of wampum belts through museums and tribal nations, focusing on the meaning, materiality, curation, and repatriation of historical wampum objects over time. Her 2008 book, Savage Kin, Indigenous Informants and American Anthropologists, from University of Arizona Press, received the inaugural Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award. And our second discussant today is Dr. Sophie Lewis, who is a visiting scholar here at the Alice Paul Center and a member of the teaching faculty of the Philadelphia branch of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Sophie is, or Dr. Lewis, I should say, is an essayist, translator, and the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family from Verso. Her research currently focuses on the ideologies of eugenic, bioconservative, and imperial feminisms, including narratives of so-called white slavery, past and present, femonationalism, and trans-exclusionary femocracy. She is also a member of the Out of the Woods Writing Collective, whose edited collection, Hope Against Hope, Writings on Ecological Crisis, is published by Common Notions. I want to thank everyone so much, especially our speakers today, for joining. And for folks who are watching on YouTube and Facebook, please feel free to make comments and ask questions. After our panelists have had a moment to discuss, we'll move on to Q&A from the audience. Okay, so after all of that, I'm pleased to pass over the mic to Kim TallBear for the presentation, Settler Love is Breaking My Heart, Sex, Kin, Country. Welcome, Dr. TallBear. Oh,
Okay, there's the unmute. Yeah. Different than Zoom. Hi, it's really nice to be here. And I'll just quickly, because I'm coming to you from Edmonton in Alberta in Canada, I'll just tell you where I am. This is Treaty 6 territory. And the treaties across Canada between settlers and Indigenous peoples were numbered. And this is a traditional gathering place for peoples including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and even more people whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence this vibrant Indigenous community in Edmonton. It's really a great place to live for that. So I will get started right away because I like to tell stories and I want to be conscious of time. So I really do appreciate everybody being here. This talk is part of a book project called Disrupting Sex and Nature, an Indigenous Relational Logic. And I'm going to be working on that over the next year during my sabbatical. So that book is going to foreground analyses of relations, not only between humans, but also with land and water loves, especially. And you'll hear something about that today. So the thinking in this talk is began as a personal project that later connected to my academic analyses of settler-colonial forms of race and kinship, embodied in concepts of nature, genes, and genomes. Excuse me. So before becoming an academic, I worked as an environmental planner for 10 years with federal agencies, with tribal organizations, tribal governments. And this work is enabled by this kind of circuitous intellectual path that I've had through multiple careers. But the bulk of my academic work has focused on forms of genetic science that construct racial categories as both method and justification for control of populations. Newer work builds on my longer standing challenges to settler control of Indigenous life by extending my critical lens to the roles of monogamy and hetero and homonormative dyadic marriage in assimilating Indigenous peoples and our relations into the colonial project. So settler colonialism transforms relations into human-centered, racialized, patriarchal property and properties. Compulsory monogamy, settler sexuality, and family go hand in hand with discourses of evolution and race. This is partly why I became interested in them. Compulsory monogamy and marriage facilitates state management of Indigenous and other human bodies, and they facilitate state management of the land. Settler sexualities and their unsustainable kin forms do not only harm humans, but they harm the earth. So I consider in this work how Indigenous relational frameworks, and I'll work that out much more extensively in the book, including with more than humans, can help to prompt more sustainable and just relations for more than just Indigenous peoples. We can go to the next slide. Just start my timer. I forgot to start it here. Okay. So I'm going to talk about country music. That's probably going to pop up a lot in this book as well and in talks I'm doing. If I were a country music singer, I would write a song called Settler Love is Breaking My Heart. I love country music in spite of its colonial land and love politics. I love the tunes and the stories. They resonate in my body and in my heart. My mother and grandparents raised me, and they raised me on country music. So I have these images. They're kind of stereotypical, but, you know, driving through the countryside in my grandparents' dusty pickup truck. We did not wear seatbelts in the 70s, as some of you will remember, or in the backseat of my mom's big blue Chrysler. We would drive country roads. We'd go into town for shopping. We'd go to powwows on another reservation. We might go to one of the rivers nearby or a little bit farther away to fish. We were often driving to a city in the next state over looking for greener grass. So at the age of 52, I've done a lot of living and traveling, and I've learned some hard lessons, although drowning my sorrows in whiskey or breaking bones at rodeos is not part of my story. So I guess you could say that my life is a softcore country song. But I grew up on the classics. Some of those people are pictured here, like Patsy, Johnny, Emmylou, George, Dolly, Charlie, and then add to that Indian country classics like Buddy Redbow and Floyd Westerman. And then more recently, I've swayed to the deep voice and storytelling of Josh Turner's hetero and amato-normative song, I Wouldn't Be a Man If a Woman Like You Was Anything I Could Resist. Last year, I was listening on repeat to Highwomen's If She Ever Leaves Me. It's a tune that Brandy Carlisle is a lead vocalist on, and it's a very couple danceable song. It's about two women in love. one of them singing to a cowboy who is eyeing up her woman. And the lyric goes, well, it takes more than love, or it takes more than whiskey to make that flower bloom. By the third drink, you'll find out she's mine. So this homonormative song exhibits the same property ethic that grounds settler heteronormative love and sex, along with its compulsory monogamy. Be it into land or a beloved's body, one stakes a sole sovereign claim as with a national flag, writing over all previous names, loves, and relations that that land and body have known. Settler love is property. Let's go to the next slide. So in the songs that I love most, country or place, more than human love, is central. Place grounds human bodies in relation to one another and in loving relation to land and water. So I'm also a fan of Irish music, both contemporary and quote unquote traditional. So take Luca Bloom's song, No Matter Where You Go, There You Are. He sings about an Algerian immigrant who, after moving around continental Europe, finally finds himself feeling somewhat at home in Galway in the west of Ireland. And the lyric goes, and Muhammad lives in Galway where the music never ends. Muhammad's fire ignited with the ancient jigs and reels. He sometimes chants in Arabic across the Galway fields. The music in Galway, it's everywhere. Fiddles, pipes, drums, and the tumultuous Corrib River that runs through the center of that small city pull hard at my heart, like the drums and the rivers of my prairie homes. I know in my own body a love like Muhammad's for Galway. But prairie lands and rivers and skies are, in fact, my truest loves, and I'm working to kick a lifelong habit or addiction to the road now that I've returned to live beneath these prairie skies. I have come to think that so much travel is unsustainable. It's environmentally and bodily unsustainable, and it actually can hinder building local community. That's especially important as one ages, I think. I have in common with many country songs that I have historically chosen the romance of the road as much as I've chosen human love. But if I were a country music singer, my narratives of lust, love, and loss would in other ways be radically different. I would sing about human and human land relations in more relational and less propertied ways. So take another lyric, Holly Williams' codependent, couple-centric song, Without You. And the lyric is, so I moved out west where the starlets play on the boulevards of West LA, and I tried to make a name. But it never felt like home to me, so I drove 3 days back to Tennessee in a slow and steady rain. And that's when I was searching. I'm not searching anymore. And that's when I was learning about the things worth living for, before I was open, before I knew I couldn't live a day without you. I really do love that tune, but I would change the words. My version would not be about romance or one true human love that I could not live without. I would sing about a love that does not save, but rather co-sustains and that does not foreclose other loves. The object of my affection is just as likely to be the prairie skies as any human, especially if I were to say I can't live without you. So I love sex unapologetically and without shame. Not all of us do, but I do. But my indigenized erotic does not privilege sex among intimacies. Multiple loving relations are not only about humans, and they're not only about sexual relations. My most beloved stretch of this planet is the prairies and the rivers of North America. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk about a couple of the analytical frameworks that I bring to this broader work that I don't know if I said is autoethnographic. It's partly ethnographic. It's partly archival, historical. I rely on historians of marriage a lot, sexuality, and then do a little bit of my own ethnography. And I'm also beginning, this next book is going to be kind of a writing experiment. It's going to have a lot of creative nonfiction in it, which I can talk about in Q&A maybe. There's a good methodological reason for doing it that way. But I want to talk about on on this slide, the idea of more than monogamy instead of non-monogamy, and then the, very basic to many of us ideas of co-production and notions of the biosocial. So I've come to prefer the concept of more than monogamy over that of non-monogamy. I follow other feminist and critical animal studies scholars in particular who refuse to center the human by attaching the non-prefix to it. So they view non-human as ethically inadequate, as othering, as kind of a human-centric descriptor. Likewise, I work to decenter monogamy. Three societal forces, again, the church, state, and science, work together to enforce monogamy as our norm. Historically, in the US and Canada, the two settler colonial countries I write about and live between, historically, it's been straight white men at the helm of our religious, state, and scientific institutions post-contact. And those people largely assume that monogamy is a natural marker of civilizational and or evolutionary advancement. You can read about that. Angela Willie's got some interesting chapters on that history in her book. More recently, there are more recent studies that hypothesize non-monogamy is instead more natural. So this is one of the current debates happening in research. But Angela Willie critiques the naturalization of both bonding forms, non-monogamy and monogamy. She critiques them as natural. In Undoing Monogamy, she takes the approach that she calls it non/monogamy, so to put non-monogamy and monogamy kind of all together in the same complex. She says they're both biosocial. And she writes, monogamy is not either biological or cultural and historical, neither is it simply both. We live in what Donna Haraway has called a nature-cultural world where what we know and what is are intimately enmeshed and co-constituted, unquote. So that means that both knowledge of monogamous pair bonding and non-monogamous bonding are co-produced with social forces, with the culture or society doing the observing. I regret that we're stuck with these words. I would like eventually me or somebody else, or many somebody else's, to theorize these ways of relating actually in indigenous languages. I think we're really inhibited by operating in English around this stuff. So co-production or co-constitution, what I more normally use of natural and social orders, has for 2 decades been informed, or it has informed already my critical analyses of racialized genomes, or racialized genomics, which is a set of co-constituted 21st century discourses and material practices, genomics, that I would say support ongoing settler-colonial identity and biological kin-making. But during the last 6 years, after spending 20 years working on genome topics, co-production or co-constitution has informed my efforts to unsettle what I call settler sex, narratives of monogamous pair bonding, marriage, and family. So bringing those frameworks forward from genome work into this work on relating, which by obviously, right, non-monogamy, monogamy, these are forms of relating, impositions of forms of relating that disrupt indigenous forms of relating, just like genomic and biological ideas of relating have disrupted indigenous forms of relating. So I came to realize, well, I thought I was going into the non-monogamy work as kind of a side project. It's totally the same thing I was already doing for 20 years. It's just, it's seemingly a completely different topic. So let's go to the next slide. And this is going to take a few minutes to get through. It's kind of dense. I don't know if anybody's familiar with David Delgado Shorter's work. I work pretty closely with David. In fact, we're co-editing an issue of the American Indian Culture and Research Journal right now on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And we're looking at discourses of colonialism and contact in SETI and in kind of, space exploration. So that's been really fun. But I've been thinking with him a lot about sexuality for a bit longer. And so I want to talk about the idea of disaggregating the objects of sex, spirit, nature, in order to reaggregate relations. And David deals with these ideas in some of his ethnographic work. So in addition to science studies scholars like Willie, Haraway, also Sheila Jasanoff, who I didn't cite, but if you know co-production, she was there in what I was doing. In addition to people like that, I, of course, center indigenous studies, relational, and feminist frameworks that I put into conversation with science studies thinkers. And together, I think all of these can help unsettle settler thought, whether science studies thinks it's necessarily doing that or not. I think the feminist science studies people for sure understand that's part of their project. So I think with David Shorter, who's working at the intersections of indigenous studies, religious studies, anthropology, to explain indigenous relational frameworks that can help us conceptually and pragmatically disaggregate social and scientific objects, sex, nature, spirit, back into webs of relation. So settler colonial thought produces said objects, for the purposes of control and management of humans and more than humans, who have been considered as less agential or less animate, as lower on a hierarchy of life. So I would say that disrupting these objects of sex, nature, and spirit is therefore anti-colonial. In his essay entitled Sexuality, Shorter focuses on Morea Kamem. These are powerful people. They are healers and seers among the UMA and indigenous people living on both sides of what is now Mexico-US border. Now, Shorter originally set out when he was working with the UMA to understand the quote-unquote spiritual aspects of what Morea Kamem, the healers and seers, do. He was trying to examine them as powerful healers, but his analysis came to entangle both sexuality and spirituality. So during his fieldwork with Southern UMA and Sonora, an elder told Shorter that individuals who engage in non-monogamous and or non-heterosexual relationships are often also Morea Kamem. But Shorter resisted classifying these individuals as gay or non-monogamous. Instead, he focused on Morea Kamem as relating. He describes their reciprocity with and the power they receive in their encounters with spirits, with ancestors, dreams, and animals. And he also describes their relations and power exchanges in the human realm, where they use their power to see for and heal other humans who are suffering, say, from love or money problems or addictions or other afflictions of mind and body. So Shorter made a decision not to ask about the details of Morea Kamem sexuality. Emphasizing relations and exchange, we too can resist Morea Kamem sexuality being objectified as gay or straight. In addition, as Shorter explains, the social role of Morea Kamem is not a means for individual self-empowerment. They do not identify themselves under that label that would objectify them as a healer or a seer, although those of us looking at them and engaging with them would identify them as such in order to refer to them. But Morea Kamem do not accentuate their personal characteristics and capacities. They don't accentuate their sexuality or their power to heal. Instead, Shorter says they focus on their practices in community as they, quote, work tirelessly and selflessly to maintain right relations. So it's all about relations rather than sort of some inherent sense of self or identity. Now, I want to talk about another idea, and that's on this slide, that Shorter proposes, objectivating the intersubjective. And it's a mouthful, and I have my undergrads write papers on this at the end of the semester in my Disrupting Sex and Nature class. In a settler-colonial frame, we are accustomed to thinking of spirituality, spirit, sexuality, or sex as things, not as relations or connected points on a web. Within a settler ontological lens, Morea Kamem become a class of person defined along either sexual and or spiritual lines. In describing how relations or the relational sharing of power become things in a non-UMA framework, Shorter uses this term, objectivating the intersubjective. Now, he has a second essay that's also really interesting to read in relation to this, just simply entitled Spirituality. So this one is sexuality, but there's also spirituality, and they're dealing with similar types of ideas. In that essay, he analyzes examples of spiritual practices in different indigenous traditions, and he explains that intersubjective, like related, emphasizes mutual connectivity, shared responsibility, and interdependent well-being. Within the Morea Kamem context, sexuality and spirituality can be seen as constituted of human relational activities. So they are sets of relations through which power is acquired and exchanged in reciprocal fashion between persons, not all of them human. And he explains below, and it's on this slide as well, you can read along. In many tribal communities, we must recognize that people are individuals more than individuals. All being is relational. It would follow then that we would need to seek an understanding of indigenous sexualities that recognizes sexuality not as a thing or object that is constituted once and unchanging. Rather, sexuality might prove to be a relating, a sharing of power, reconstituted over and over based on the intersubjective dynamism of two or more persons. Seen this way, sexuality would then appear as a way of being that which directly and intentionally mediates social relations across the family, clan, pueblo, tribe, and other forms of relations, including not more than human or other than human persons. Sexuality starts looking in this context more like a type of power, particularly one capable of healing. Approaching sexuality studies in this way, in a way that de-objectifies sexuality, that sees sexuality as a mode of relating, is one of the series of theoretical postulates that we must wrestle with in Indigenous studies scholarship. And I think we are beginning to do that. So understanding Morea Kamem relationality and community can help us understand both their so-called sexuality and spirituality, and ours too, I think, as acts of reciprocity and power exchange. So one can begin also to see how a relational circulation of healing power is not compatible with the categorical and property imperatives of settler sex and marriage. Neither is a relational analysis compatible with the idea of indigenizing sexuality. Rather, we might consider that the goal is to disaggregate so-called sexuality, not back in time into tradition, not forward into progress, but into and back out into that web of relations. I try to get away from these kind of linear temporal frameworks in terms of thinking. If we think about this web or net, we can think, I think, more easily about relations exchanging power and power being intention, thus holding the web or community together. And I think it's easier to think about creating change if we're thinking more about the present in this kind of plane or web versus thinking about the past, the future, progress in the future. Just want to talk about nature also as relations really quickly. We've talked more about spirituality and sexuality. So after Shorter's analysis, we might think of not only sex and spirit, but also nature as not a thing at all, but also as sets of relations in which power circulates. So again, prior to dipping my toes into the topical waters of sexuality studies, much of my work addressed nature, both human and more than human nature. So I also focus on various forms of nature in my own analyses of relations objectified. In analyses of genomic and environmental phenomena, I keep in mind, I live on a busy street, sorry. I keep in mind the circulation of power, which might be otherwise described as material or energetic sustenance, embodied in flesh, other organismic material, in stone or in other earthly elements, whether such materiality is consumed, conjoined with, or harvested for, say, the weaving of baskets or canoes or the carving of ceremonial pipes. If the circulation of power and material forms of sustenance, I ask after Shorter, if we might resist objectivating the intersubjective. Might we resist hardening these relations between humans and other than humans into objects? Maybe, for example, a ceremonial pipe or a basket is not an artifact or an art object, but a being, and we can play with that word, right? Especially if you're talking in indigenous languages, co-constituted with the materiality and life force of its human and other than human makers. There's a lot conceptually and ethically at stake in our resistance to these key objectifications of sex, spirit, and nature that are sort of forced onto us in settler colonial thought. And it's not only conceptually that there's a lot at stake, there's a lot pragmatically at stake. Relational frames that help de-objectify spirituality, sexuality, and nature might help humans be more attuned to relating carefully and robustly in practice as we consider the reverberations of our movements across that web of relations. Might we develop more robust language and approaches in our advocacy for less objectivating, less extractive property type claims on the bodies and resources of our kin, our loves, our relations, both human and more than human. Objectifying our relations has, after all, enabled treating them as properties for us and within us. Making relations into properties and property is, of course, central to speciesism, racism, genetic fetishism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, extractivism, and the ecological crisis we find ourselves in. Conceptual and pragmatic de-objectifying approaches will obviously be aided by thinking, theorizing, and doing in indigenous languages that are co-constituted with radically different relational ontologies. And this is why indigenous language is critical. I'm not saying you know, this word fluent, I don't bother with that. We just begin theorizing, I think, in the language. Let's go to the next slide, finally. Okay. So the third analytical framework that I deal with, and some of you will know this in the audience, I use a robust definition of decolonization, and I'm very careful when I use that word, guided by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang's insistence that decolonization is not a metaphor, that it requires the restitution of indigenous land and life, or you could say the land and life of the colonized. Not all colonized peoples are necessarily defined as indigenous. So I have a question here on this slide. If decolonized relationship forms cannot be exactly what our ancestors' relationship forms were, and I'm thinking in terms of my Dakota ancestors, can they be other than predicated on settler-imposed compulsory monogamy and nuclear family norms, twinned with private property constituted of appropriated indigenous ground, water, and other resources, and combined with the imposition of settler laws designed to disrupt and steal indigenous relations? So it's really about thinking about fundamental ideas and manifesting those in terms of what our contemporary options might be. But again, whenever I use the word decolonize in any kind of in relation to any kind of topic, I'm always thinking about the restitution of the land and life of the colonized. And we can think creatively about that, but not using that word unless that's what I actually mean, material restitution. So if indigenous life is co-constituted with land, water, and other than human relatives, then our so-called sexualities and our relationships will continue to be violently shaped and oppressed, along with an earth subjected to settler-colonial capitalist extraction and rule. So we can't, in fact, have decolonized relations among humans and between humans and non-humans until we are dealing with this colonial capitalist extraction and rule. It's impossible within that system. Restoring indigenous relations includes not only land and water relations, but also, of course, relations between humans. Yet, and this is a critique of indigenous studies, our analyses of colonial theft and subsequent restoration of land, indigenous life and relations rarely, if ever, question settler impositions of compulsory monogamy that helped privatize and constitute land ownership for settler men, their families, their corporations, and states. The state also forced indigenous men, women, and children into this oppressive system via land allotment policies, compulsory conversion to Christianity, relocation programs mid-20th century, and residential schools, and the indoctrination and abuses of these systems. State programs, policies, and institutions simultaneously work to eliminate gender and sexuality non-conforming persons as well. It's all about disrupting relations at every single level. That's what the settler colonialism has been about for indigenous people and for other marginalized and exploited peoples as well. Okay, so I've done my editorializing and I'm trying to figure out where to pick up. So it's because I hold to the idea of the co-constitution of natural and social orders that I put a lot of stock in the benefits of articulating another redemptive narrative beyond US and Canadian settler colonial exceptionalisms. One to guide and give us hope, to help us work from multiple directions to constitute decolonized ways of relating between humans and more than humans. I wrote in 2019 in another paper that we should be practicing in every possible moment, and this is maybe a pragmatic thing, small acts of visionary resistance, deep narrative and ontological revision that forego the relentlessly violent love of the settler nation state or any nation state. Instead, we should favor loving and caring for relatives, both human and other than human, whose lives depend upon these lands. So again, thinking in relational terms versus nationalistic terms. Grounding violent settler states like the US and Canada is their insistence on compulsory monogamy, state-sanctioned marriage to help effect property claims over the bodies of humans, especially women and children, and all of our more than human relatives. So let's go to the next slide. And I just want to call quick attention to this before moving to another before talking about settler sexuality more explicitly. I just want to say that these two ideas, solo polyamory and relationship anarchy, and I've keynoted a solo polyamory conference that keynotes online if you're interested in that. Those are interesting. They have been interesting ideas for me to work with in terms of moving away from compulsory monogamy and settler sexuality. But most mainstream forms of polyamory are of course another form of settler sexuality, but these two forms of relating in particular have been nice placeholders until I can forge a language that I think better captures or perhaps indigenizes more than monogamous relating. And I just have definitions on this slide taken from the first one. The solo polyamory definition is taken from a members only Facebook page, and it's basically polyamory that's non-nesting, sort of emphasizing autonomy along with good relating and building sustainable networks. I'm going to write about that extensively and analyze that in my book. I do think the language of autonomy gets put forward a lot in solo polyamory and also in relationship anarchy. But in fact, I see people in those two communities doing a lot of community building, a lot of mutual aid, thinking a lot about sustainability of relations. So I kind of think autonomy gets overblown a bit in both of those communities. And so I wanted to put that out there as kind of a place where I can stand right now and be in conversation. I will say that both of these, though, while I think they have really interesting and productive ways of helping us expand our relational ideas, they are more human-centric. Although I'm going to dig more into that and see if I can see signs, particularly in relationship anarchy, of them thinking beyond the human. It's really possible. I'm not an anarchist scholar, so I'm interested in digging more into that and seeing what kinds of articulations there are, particularly between relationship anarchy and the kinds of relational ways of doing love, lust, and and connecting that I'm talking about. So let's go to the next slide. I am running out of time. I don't want to go over time. So I just wanted to define settler sexuality. I probably should have done this up front, but I hear you have, the images of what we're all supposed to aspire to. This is the good and the normal. You're supposed to be a good citizen. Well, whether it's explicit or implicit, part of being a good citizen is having your relationships look like these, right? So I'm drawing a lot on Scott Morgenson, who's a queer theorist at Queen's, settler scholar, but who's done a lot of work in contextualizing settler sexuality, and he's in deep conversation with indigenous studies scholars. And so he just simply defines it as the heteropatriarchal and sexual modernity exemplary of white settler civilization. He's written on settler homo-nationalism as well. He's really looking at the relationships between sexuality, family, and the state, the white nationalist state, and particularly in the US, but also Canada. And a more lengthy definition is the white national hetero and increasingly homonormativity that regulates indigenous sexuality and gender and the rest of us by supplanting them with the sexual modernity of settler subjects. Angela Willey, in her book Undoing Monogamy, also gets at this, how these forms of sexuality and love marriages become kind of part of the civilizational discourse of who's advanced versus who's backwards, right? Solo polyamory and relationship anarchy, to think about the last slide, help me focus on a fuller spectrum of relations and on dismantling hierarchy among those relations. But again, as I said, solo poly and RA are more human-centric in their foci, so I'm really interested in moving beyond that as well. And I also just wanted to say quickly, too, I get this question a lot. Settler is a term we use a lot in Canada. It's not much used in the United States, and a lot of thinkers in the US don't like it. They say it's not strong enough. We should be using invader or colonizer. Those are fine terms too, but up here, settler sounds a lot stronger. So it's interesting when US people push back on that all the time because they don't think it sounds critical enough, but it's heard a bit differently up here. And I also wanted to say I'm much more interested in looking at the ways that we all can uphold settler-colonial structures, all of us, than in nitpicking who is a settler and who is not a settler. That's a conversation that happens a lot up here. I think trying to define who is a settler or not definitively is the same kind of project as trying to define who belongs to what race definitively. This is not a definitive scientific project, right? It's really how are we all kind of contributing to upholding those structures, or how are we all called into upholding those structures? And that's really what my analyses are always structural, even though I might use the term settler. I'm not really within these pictures, you can say, yeah, this is clearly kind of upholding these sort of family dynamics, and indigenous people are being asked to be and desiring to be complicit in this too. So I'm not leaving us. We just don't have any powerful people like this in political positions yet, or as soon as we do, I'll be putting them on that slide. So let's just move to the last slide really quickly. And I want to, this is not really, you know how French movies just end? They don't really have a conclusion, they just end. Well, that's kind of what I'm going to do today. So, because I'm beginning to move into this kind of creative nonfiction type writing, and I could have done something like that. So the last couple of things I have to say are kind of a segue to a much longer performative piece that I do on an unsettling marriage and unsettling place. And this is a little personal. So I begin with this lyric by Sunny Sweeney. You don't go until you're praying to break even, until staying is worse than leaving. God knows we tried everything we could do. You can keep your pride and blame me if you need to. So I personally attempted to unsettle my state-sanctioned marriage 11 years ago in 2010. And as it turns out, I thought we did everything, but we didn't actually try everything. I did not know at that time that I could or should ask for a different kind of relating, a differently shaped household. I found myself miserable in monogamous marriage, presenting as a respectable nuclear family in a single family home in a densely populated, overpriced city. I then made the intellectual leap at that time to thinking, oh, well, perhaps he's the wrong one. You know, like our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, like they're supposed to be the one, right? The Savior. So even though I was raised happily by grandmothers and a great grandmother and sometimes overcrowded housing conditions in the middle of a sparsely populated prairie, I thought these things. I also was raised in a community where we were not middle class and we had very few married couples around. And I now realize that this was bliss. This was matriarchal bliss, that we didn't have all these couple-headed families around kind of contaminating that world that we were living in. I was also in a settler marriage, a normative marriage, a little confused about which sets of relations were contributing most to my misery. Was it mostly this nuclear family, respectability kind of thing? I found that so smothering. Or was my misery also sparked by being a displaced prairie person? I really felt physically agitated and uncomfortable, hemmed in between the sea and the mountains in Central Coast California where we lived. I worried, we have our ancestors come get you when you die. And I worried, like, how would they find me out there? What if I'm stranded on the precipice of this deep, dark, scary sea? It's like an abyss with sharks in it. This is not nice for a prairie person. So I was longing for I came to realize for the prairies, the relatively empty prairies, for this kind of woman-headed communal kind of way of living. And it makes total sense that I was longing for that. But this kind of norm of settler sex and family, this is heavy what they put on us, right? So it took me a few years to understand that though it was both place and a normative structure of marriage that felt really intolerable to me and that made me feel alienated from the relations of my heart, both the prairie and these kind of extended family, woman-headed kinds of family structures. So, but 11 years later, I've come to feel that I wish I had understood back then what I understand now, that it was a structural problem. It was not the individual themselves. Some people have problems with the individuals they're relating with. For me, it really was structural. It really was about place, and there was nobody to help explain these kinds of things to me. So it's been 10 pretty painful but productive years of learning how to make sense of this. And I wish you wish you could go back in time and make gentler, wiser choices. And this is why I talk about these things openly. So I'm about to end. I really want to help make space for others who don't understand. I think this is an oppressive system for all of us. And I don't think it's only Indigenous people that are miserable in this system. It's a lot of people that are feeling smothered, and are not flourishing in this kind of relationship system that a settler state, that the colonizer has put on all of us. And I want to just move to one last slide just to provoke conversation, perhaps. I think about Indigenous ways of relating as sites of biocultural hope. And this is amidst devastation. I think that we can also have these places in which we thrive and can have hope. Radical hope. That's another paper that I do. It's not Barack Obama's kind of hope. But these are pictures of Indigenous gatherings and resistances, water defenders and land defenders. And so I think a lot about, but they're the kinds of communal extended relations. And I want to think about the fluidity between environmental movements. We would calls these things in settler kinds of concepts, environmental movements, resistances. But really, these are ways of relating as well. Anyway, that's kind of leading into a whole other topic. So I think I'll stop here because I'd rather converse with all of you. And I am over by about 6 minutes. I'm very sorry for that. So.
That's quite all right. Thank you so much for sharing this work. It's so exciting to hear just at all of the scales that you're theorizing this, at the level of, broad scale thinking about monogamy gets used as a property, or relations as property under capitalism, and we're conscripted into forming the nation state. I just feel like you're covering so many scales, which I think is really exciting to hear, and makes it easier to think through some of these concepts. So I would like to bring in Marge and Sophie, who are going to offer some comments and ask questions. And I also just want to encourage folks in the audience, we haven't had any questions come in yet, but you are welcome to post questions on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll try and get to them here.
Sophie, can you go first?
Sure. Thank you, Marge. Kim, I have a million things in my head, and I just want to say thank you for to everyone, to Maria, for the privilege of this interlocution. You ended with something about hope, and it resonates a lot with me. I'm part of a writing collective that decided to entitle its recent sort of collection of books Hope Against Hope, inspired by indigenous theorizing of the sort of settler temporality that hope implies. And you had that aside about the sort of Barack Obama notion of hope, and the way it is actually sort of superseded, or perhaps there's a sort of practice of on the ground utopianism in and against that kind of hope politics. The reason we said hope against hope was because we had a sort of consensus that if we hope for something, it's for something better than hope as a framework for our politics. And I think this links to something I've heard you say several times on the question of abundance rather than sufficiency. And I think people are asking for a reframing of sufficiency and adequacy as utopia. I don't know if you've noticed something like that, but I see you, and I could be wrong, and this is my question, I suppose. I see you as asking for something better than hope, as well as, of course, being informed by cosmologies and temporalities that are already outside of that teleology, but also politically positioning yourself in rejection of austerity and a sort of socialism of adequacy. I see you as being someone who stands for abundance, and I was wondering if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I don't like the word hope. This is why I really like that I've got a lot of students working in different, working in Cree in particular. I want to find ways to talk about these things that are not, so whenever I use hope, I want to use scare quotes around it. So I'm interested, is this a book you're working on?
I didn't mean to plug our book. Common Notions. Yeah, it's already out. It's an essay collection called Hope Against Hope. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to check that out. And there are indigenous thinkers in there as well, or you're working based on them?
Our collective is all settlers or Europeans who don't even know that there's such a thing. But we are indebted to indigenous thinkers. Yeah. Around.
Yeah. So no, I think I talk in the paper that I talk about radical hope. I just take it from Junot Diaz, and he's talking about from the bottom, right? From the bottom comes these ideas for. But yeah, I am uncomfortable with that word, so I really do look forward to reading that. And this is why I think eventually in the book I'm going to be drawing on indigenous relational frameworks and work. These are kinds of placeholder things, but I'll go somewhere else with that. And then your question on sufficiency versus abundance. I do use the term sufficiency sometimes, but I'm not thinking of just enough. I'm thinking of being sated. Is that like satisfied, right? Not hungry. Not that hunger is not sometimes, because I come from a society where we move. Yeah, it's not that we never had hunger, but I don't know how to answer your question. But I guess I do think I think about abundance in, maybe I'll redefine it in a different way, like an abundance of relations, but that doesn't mean you never sometimes your relations eat you. So it doesn't mean that it's a utopia either, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. This is interesting to me, but I don't know how to answer your question.
Marge, may I follow up real quick? And then it's just, thanks. So this is actually the same thought for me. You are really good, I think, at, you do so many events. I don't know how you do it. And I've heard you so many times push back against the sort of romanticization of counter kinship or queer and indigenous kinship even, right? Because you aren't saying that all your relatives are people. In fact, I've heard you say you don't like all of your relatives, they remain your relatives, right? And this is something Alexis Shotwell also says to white settlers, you have to claim your bad kin. So I guess if I may, just something about, could you tell us a little bit more about how we bring excitement and desire into the politics of what does Shorter say, intersubjective
objectivating intersubjective.
So how do we sort of navigate through the risks of kind of romanticizing and then not being not having enough kind of a vision on the other hand? Because obviously I'm sure, like you, because I was known for being a critic of the family, and before the pandemic, several editors at various magazines were quite clear that this was not a topic they would really take seriously. And then with the lockdown, I honestly think a lot of editors had the experience of, confronting the private nuclear household and all the sort of deathly modes of kinning, and then went, oh, who's talking about that? I'm sure you got a lot of emails as well. And that really changed. So that's also something you said at the end of your talk. But there is also a very defanging way of framing a critique of settler sexuality, propertarian kinship, and so on, that takes out the critique of capital, the critique of colonialism. And so we get a lot of editorials that do this kind of soft critique of the family. And I think part of that is a tendency to want to just romanticize kinning and maybe this intersubjective modality and all the sort of tentacularity and pluralization of relations that Donna Haraway also talks about. So how do we do it in a way that doesn't that recognizes, as you often remind us, that it's also about violence and mess and contestation and even boredom and stuff like that. Thanks.
That's a good question. I mean, I focus on relations broadly. I use the word family when I'm talking about settler family. When I'm talking about my own, I talk about extended relations or which help form you as who you are. It doesn't mean it's always nice. Like, I'm not formed, in a bed of roses here, like, right? There's some really amazing things I talk about, but there's also some real traumas and hardships and violences that helped form who I am now, right? Yeah, and I don't know, I don't know, I'm not sure what to say beyond what you've already said. I think we need to claim our genealogies, even if they're not what we would like them to be. I think we need to be honest or open about who formed us and how they formed us. Gosh, Sophie, you're really stumping me here.
No, that I did. Thank you. Maybe it's just because I've read so much of your stuff recently, so I'm just telling you what you've already said. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, though.
Thank you, Katsio Leone. Thank you so much, Kim, for this talk. This is and I need to start because in introducing, I need to explain that my homeland is in Abenaki territory. So I'm speaking to you from Indakina, and the University of Pennsylvania is in Lenapehoking, Lenape territory. And it occurs to me as I was listening to you speak that we are also co-constructing settler colonialism and the way we move to and through these places. So my home place is in the mountains, in the forests, on the river, on the Quinnipiac, the long river that runs here. And Katalnabaywi in the Abenaki way, when we're thinking about relationships, and I say this as an adult learner of the language, not as a childhood learner of the language, but we are compelled to think about not who we are and where we are centered, but who we are related to. So it's impossible to speak most Algonquian languages without specifying who are your kin, where is your homeland, and you are always, linguistically, you are always in a state of being, in a state of moving to, from, within, between, human, other than human, more than human, all of these landscapes. So sometimes it just means that our thought patterns are shaped by the colonial settler landscapes we live in as much as our language patterns. So that being said, one of the questions that came to mind that I'd like to sort of put to you and have you think about is, to what degree have we been trained to think of diaspora and relocation as permanent removals? To what degree have Indigenous peoples been forced to accept where they are now as their current homeland, their current sovereign territory, without full consideration of how they still own that place they came from, or that place where they came into being in the world? And even when we talk about the treaty number territories in Canada, or we talk about reserve lands in the US, we are still circumscribing those territories in a colonial settler framework. So yes, I agree with you, decolonization means giving land back, but in the interim, what can we do to reclaim the land in other ways? What can we do to reclaim the places we come from? And part of what provokes us, just to dwell on it, just to touch, is that my nation, Abenaki, is divided by current state lines, current federal lines. There are movements over time of multiple nations. So Abenaki, even by definition, is multiple tribal nations folded into various refugee communities as a result of the French and Indian Wars. And so where those communities landed determines to what degree they have recognition by the settler colonial states that surround them. And the same is true of Stockbridge Mohican, of Brotherton, of multiple other nations that have been removed and relocated. So I'll sort of stop there. I'd love to hear your thinking on that. How do Indigenous people reclaim where they are and where they came from? And how can, for lack of a better term, settler colonials or colonizers or invaders better understand and interpret that? Because land acknowledgements obviously are not enough.
It's because I come from a people that were not moved that far away. It was genocidal and very violent, but we still have regular migratory practices between the reservations that were established during the reservation era and traditional homelands. And there are Dakota populations in all of those places. So while yes, a tribal government doesn't have jurisdiction over downtown St. Paul, we still, there's Dakota language, there's monuments, they're changing place names, right? There's been a lot of controversy in Minneapolis, and I think St. Paul too, around insisting on putting Dakota place names back on things, because there is like total settler fragility. They won't even let you change the name of a lake or a parkway. They got all freaked out about it, even though they still own everything. So, I don't know. I mean, like those kinds of things it's been really interesting to watch those place name changes in the Twin Cities, and how incomprehensible that is to a lot of whites. Very just incomprehensible. I don't know what non-whites think. That's really interesting to me, right? Most of the kind of resistance I've seen in the press has been by relatively wealthy whites who feel entitled. Like the war is over, we won, you lost, why are you still here? But so it's interesting. Like at first I thought, place names, whatever, but you actually see that it's pushing people and it's pushing their thinking in a really interesting way. So I do, and like land acknowledgements, the same thing. Yes, if they become rote, but what I see in Edmonton now is I actually see institutions pushing the land acknowledgement towards, well, here's what it means and here's what we're doing about it. Yes, it's these, but here's how we're engaging with the community. It's really and so that's kind of the next level, I think. I think in the places where they are not intuitive, where people are surprised, in that moment they're doing work, but that moment quickly becomes over, right? And then you've got to move to the next thing. So I think, you know, asking people who are actually removed halfway across the continent, I'd be really interested to hear from them. That's not the case of my people. And I feel like we still have presence in our home territories, as well as now these newer reservation territories. So.
Well, and part of what brought that to mind is Ned Blackhawk was here virtually here doing a great talk yesterday on indigenous activism in the early 20th century. And one of the things that came up was these constant movements that have sort of a through thread from the early 20th century, the different Native organizations that come about in New England. It's the Algonquin Indian Council, it's the Society of American Indians, it's these different societies that then become folded into other movements where Native people from various locations, including displaced urban Indians, are coming together to try to claim territory and claim political sovereignty and claim political presence. And so that's another question I sort of wanted to ask you about is what is your sense of a through line from the activist, so the Native-led, First Nations, Indigenous, Native-led activist movements of the early 20th century to where we are in the present day with different groups of people making common cause for similar concerns. And part of why I want to ask you this is that many of us are all too well aware of the gender violence that was part of some of these movements. So in some ways, there was a lot of positive movement in visibility, but there was also backward movement in activist embrace of colonial settler models of gender roles.
I mean, I don't study social movements or these activist movements. I'm familiar with, you know, what was going on in the 70s because I was there as a kid, right? But not as a scholar, you know. I'm familiar with what some of those dynamics were firsthand. But I certainly can address the through line, as you put it. I am very interested in the woman, queer, and two-spirit leadership that we've seen in more recent land defender and water protector movements. I think that's really, this is a really interesting moment to me, and I really am quite pleased to see some of, you know, the usual suspects in our cultures coming to the fore, but not in settler culture, right? And I heard I wasn't at Standing Rock. I had a lot of friends and some relatives there, though. I heard that people were being called to account behind the scenes in a way I don't remember happening when I was a kid, like in the American Indian movement. There was a lot of really powerful things that happened in terms of institution building during AIM, and it wasn't by the photo op men at the front of the line either, right? It was by people behind the scenes. But I definitely remember totally misogynistic dynamics when I was a child, really, really off-putting to say the least. And so I think recently we've seen some things shift, I think, maybe, although I know that men had to be called into line, you know, as well in these recent movements and continue to be. So that's not really an answer to the question. I'm not a historian of the social movements, but I feel like there's some really good work. And this is why I've said this in many other talks before. I really take a lot of inspiration in my theoretical inspiration from queer and two-spirit Indigenous people, most of them younger than me, some of them in my generation, but mostly younger, who really have been doing the work for a while of reminding us how deeply sexuality and ways of intimate relating were totally directed by colonizers, right? And disrupted our ancestors' ways of relating. So, you know, I bring a lot of different threads of different scholarship together, and am very methodologically, I think, and theoretically promiscuous, but I'm just bringing into conversation what a lot of other people are already saying in other areas. And I hope that comes across, like I'm trying to be in conversation with a lot of people that aren't normally at the same conversational table and bring those threads together. I don't view myself as doing some new super innovative thing, but rather I'm facilitating conversation among previously disparate parties, I think.
Thank you. I see that questions are starting to show up in the comments. So Sophie, do you want to jump in or should we start doing questions?
I think it would be great. We have 25 minutes left.
Okay, excellent.
I think, and Kim, you stated characteristically a kind of a desire for the conversation rather than a formal respondent.
Totally.
Type role. So we've got two really interlinked questions that in the one of them from Ashley Gold saying whether we could speak on the use of the project of family abolition, which I know is not actually a framework you use, Kim, but
No,
for Land Back, for Free Palestine, and for anti-colonial movements around the world. And then the follow-up is from Amanpreet Singh asking how, and I think this is really, I know you've written on this, how the notion of state borders and nationhood reinforces the centering of humans and monogamy. And so the question being, how does breaking from nuclear family norms and marriage inherently also mean breaking from states? Maybe you speaking first to the latter would then, if there's time, I can also speak a little bit.
Yeah, because I'm not sure what family abolition means. I mean, I can have a sense of what it probably means, but it's not a word I use. So the second one, I think, the couple-headed nuclear family, usually heteronormative, is so deeply entangled with the imposition of settler state sovereignty. I think if we dispense with that as a relational goal, I think we are much helped by also dispensing with our sense of allegiance or love for the state. And I talk about this in this other paper I had published in CalFU a couple of years ago, that we need to take our eyes off the state and stop cultivating a love and allegiance to it, because it really is fundamentally about disrupting good relations in the world. Not all relations are good, but they're going to be gooder without that, right? Without the sort of exclusionary hierarchy of life type values that adhere in the settler state. And that's what I'm familiar with. I mean, I am somewhat myopic in that way, right? That I'm looking at settler colonialism. I'm and I'm following a lot of kind of more global thinkers, people that are anti-imperialist, and, but that's not yet my language and not yet so I don't want to speak to things beyond my ken either. And then, but family abolition, like, what is that? Am I basically saying that, or?
Well, it depends who you ask. I would say so. It's a debate I have been privileged to have with Black feminists. Actually, Jasbir Puar has been in generative disagreement and questioning around this tactically with me. In a messaging conversation we had behind the scenes of a Twitter debate. So to answer your question directly, it's in some ways an orthodox Marxist concept, and that's sort of, I suppose, a tradition I belong to, and I tried to hybridize promiscuously with indigenous and Black feminisms, queer theory, and autonomist traditions such as wages against housework in my book, Surrogacy Now. And so in the abolition there, as I understand it, is the sense of world unmaking and making that is already ongoing, as used by Ruth Wilson Gilmore for prison abolition, for instance. It's not a deletion or a destruction exclusively. It's about a proliferation of relations. So I would certainly say that you're with me in family abolitionism, but I am absolutely kind of, so to answer the very quickly, how could this be of use in relation to Land Back or Free Palestine, anti-colonial movements around the world? The question links very well to the other questioner's emphasis on the question of nationalism, because if you for me, if you do nationalism in your anti-colonialism, you will not be a family abolitionist. The question of these proprietarian relations, can sometimes be, they can be put to one side by people who are sort of fighting the settler state, right? We need to be so attentive to the history of anti-colonial and colonized and Black families against the state. So I hope I am not easily misunderstandable and misreadable as saying that somehow migrant families or Black families or indigenous families who have had their children stolen into the foster system, or that, you know, should
Right.
somehow be, you know, that's somehow okay. No,
that wouldn't even, yeah.
The edifice of, you know, family as a property regime is precisely the regime of reproductive stratification that is also, you know, leading to apartheid in Palestine and, you know, dispossessing indigenous modes of relation and living on the land. So I would say, yeah, so that would be my answer. Marge, would you like to also? Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say too, so I'm going to be engaging with like various forms of land back just to highlight other people's work in that. And so the Yellowhead Institute at Ryerson has a land back report that I need to dig into. But as I dig into it now, thanks to this question, I probably would have anyway, but it'll be interesting to think about how are they thinking about family? How are they thinking about relations within that report, you know, and how is that, because there is a lot of conversation around land back in Canada right now. And I just haven't had a chance to dig into a lot of that conversation, but of course I will with this lens around marriage and family. So thank you for that question. Sorry, Marge, go ahead.
So I'd like to pull up a few questions from the comments, and one comes from, let's see, I'm not sure how to do this. I'll just read it since I'm not sure how to highlight it. Okay. But Gohan Baptiste asks, I'm wondering how we balance recognition by the settler state for polyamorous relationship webs, as we are not protected from discrimination, housing, employment, parenting. And the follow-up from the same individual is, with the need to do away with the state's monopoly on whose relationships are valid and whose are not.
So I think, are they asking, as the state increasingly recognizes multiple relating, I'm not really quite sure.
Or how does the state restrict the possibility of multiple relating? So
yeah, I mean, well, okay. So I think the question is kind of about balancing the strategic need for settler state recognition, while we know that ultimately we don't want the settler state to have the power to do that recognition.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what it is?
And also discrimination. So the notion that, you know, the emphasis, I mean, for instance, you even see it in hiring practices, the emphasis on two-parent household, the emphasis on the partner, even in hiring in academia, the additional spousal hire. So there is this sort of duality in it. So I think they're asking about a lot of this.
And I'm not, so I don't, I agree. We live in this tension. I mean, it's the same thing as me wanting to disaggregate, you know, sexuality into relations. I still recognize that we have to do work to protect sexual category, people who inhabit oppressed sexual categories, right? Like strategically, we need to do that work, even though I would like to see a world where we're not having to categorize everybody into these things, right? According to these kinds of settler hierarchies. So I don't know how to answer that question except to say, yes, it's totally a tension. We operate strategically and talk out of this side of our mouth to try to get more within the state, and out of this side to say, but the state shouldn't have that power. So there's a really good book by Nathan Rambukkana that gets at some of this called Fraught Intimacies. And I think he's particularly looking at Canada, but he's looking at sort of state policy around polyamory and the limits of it as well. You know, people advocating for it, but also it's quite limited in terms of what we can do within that structure. So I'm totally not answering these questions today.
This is fine. This is a great conversation. But what that also brings to mind for me is the situation in Canada. Some of my friends at Odanak First Nation, for example, will talk about how in their families or in related families, there was a period of time when women did not name the fathers of their children, because under the Indian Act, who could be part of the reserve was mediated by these weird genealogical linkages that were not always convenient. And so there are many children who appear not to have parents on paper, but actually do. So sometimes there is that kind of strategy. Who do you name as kin, and why do you need to even do that?
And for whose purpose, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sophie, can I hand it back to you?
Sure, yeah. We have a question in the chat about the disaggregation of nature and spirituality from Kira Lightning. So Kira writes that this is something they would like to hear more about, especially in regards to the growing popular interest in indigenous environmental knowledges being heavily spiritualized.
Oh yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly what Kira's asking, but I mean, I think actually if we can get away from this word spirituality and this idea of this kind of spirit material divide, it will be easier to dissuade people from the kind of spiritual appropriation that they're involved in. So I think like about I only briefly referred to the pipestone, to the ceremonial pipes in here, but there's one carver and quarrier that I have talked to more than many others, who makes an argument about the sort of pragmatic, he didn't call it a technology, but the way he described it is the pipe is almost a technology that helps produce relations between people. You smoke it together to greet each other and to establish good relations. It need not be this sacred thing that gets hidden away. You, like he was saying, they used to just hang it up somewhere. And when these things become secret, like sex, they become secret and private, and we have to be careful about them, is when settlers were banning them and outlawing them and making them deviant kinds of practices, right? And then it kind of becomes interior and private. So I think if we can, think about how to engage with these spiritual things or sexual things in ways that are not fetishizing and privatizing them, neither shouting them from the mountaintops in an evangelistic manner either, but just considering these as mundane but important ways of relating, I think it'll help us dissuade some of that spiritual appropriation, because suddenly it just doesn't seem as spiritual anymore. I don't know what the spiritual appropriators are looking for, but I don't think they're looking for the mundane obligations of daily relationality. I don't think that's really what they're looking for. I think they're looking for something transcendent and mystical, and something, because they're coming out of this worldview where they want to transcend the material. They, that's, and I don't think that's what indigenous ways of relating were necessarily about, because even I'm getting into this in other talks too, even when you're talking about the spiritual, that you're talking about the stars, you're talking about fire and energy, the matter and the power of the universe. These are material things. This isn't just some mystical spiritual mumbo jumbo. These are powerful material entities that we come from, that our ancestors came from, that the planet comes from. This is very inspiring, but I don't think it's the kind of transcendent spirituality that the appropriators are looking for. So I don't know, maybe I'm just being overly optimistic, but I think we can dissuade them from some of this if we embrace some of these the frameworks of disaggregation a bit.
Well, and what that immediately brings to mind is national parks that have been set aside as supposed wilderness preserves, where things start to die, or museums where these powerful objects go to die. And something I just want to put in there that I also was thinking when you were talking about how we circulate power in objects that are not meant to be artifacts, but are beings that are co-constituting relationships. One of the things that has been so powerful in this wampum repatriation work is seeing what happens when these belts that have been in museums come back home to communities. And there was a moment at the recital of the Great Law at Akwesasne a few years back when the wampum belts that had been returned to the Haudenosaunee were brought out during the reading. And for much of the time, they were simply displayed on tables. But then there was a moment when the chiefs and the elders and the councilwomen who were there said, we want everyone to interact with these beings. They were frozen in the museum, but now they are back among us. And it was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen and ever been privy to be witness to have people interacting with these things that had been taken away, or even things is the wrong word, these beings that have been taken away, that you can see and sense are visibly coming back to life now that they are spoken over. Now that they are carried to Washington to remind the obligations that were encoded in them, now that they are brought out in front of the people. So I think even in indigenous communities, the fetishization of objects, you are so right, has isolated some very powerful beings from the communities that they belong to and that they need to interact with.
It has inhibited our relations as humans too, I think. So, yeah.
I'd like to jump on that and ask you about erotophobia, whether or not you use that term. I actually learned it kind of recently because I encountered it kind of the hard way. Actually, I read a documentary about a settler conservation project in South Africa, working with a particular octopus in the Great African Kelp Forest, as erotic in a way very much kind of inspired by you. And I came up against a lot of horror about this, which I think has a relation to the COVID era in some way that I have sort of speculated about, but that's a parenthesis. But I wanted to just, humorously, because we're coming to the end of this, I wanted to ask you about work and whether you sometimes might link what we've just discussed in terms of the sort of fetishization of sex, the Spanish interview with you that calls you Kim TallBear, the polyamorous that wants to destroy sex. You're talking about, this is so relevant to the idea of what the abolish in family abolition means.
Okay.
Right? Because you're saying it doesn't make, you want to abolish the idea of it as belonging somehow over there, right? As I understand. So, and it made me laugh so much because Marco Rubio, of all people, tweeted out and then deleted a couple of days ago that sending $250 per month per child is, with no work requirement in this pandemic, is welfare. Being pro-family, he wrote, means being pro-work. And obviously, so for me, because I come from the tradition of sort of anti-work Marxism, which, don't. But I was curious. So for me, this was like, this is what I've been saying all along. Being pro-family means being pro-work. But I also think of this as quite a good provocation for you, whether you see that as a line of, because we are having a massive sort of societal fight right now, which is using, in many ways, certain bodies and populations as sort of sacrifice zones, as you well know, given the politics of, COVID vaccines on the reservation, and what we have been able to learn about this kind of individuality, this mutual, almost erotic tenderness of sort of masking and distancing and looking after one another and looking after one another's survival, that settler society, particularly in the US, has failed so spectacularly at, right? Has failed. The US, where I am on Lenni Lenape land, unceded, I should have said, has been just the worst possible country, right? A nation state in terms of COVID. And I think something about Marco Rubio's statement that being pro-family in that way that, you took those images of the Obamas, the Bidens, the Bushes, for me, they always evoke almost horror movies. I know you're a horror movie aficionado, but when you say this is all what we're supposed to aspire to, I am always really, I know so you're a horror movie buff, so you know as well as I do that the horror is always coming from inside the house in these movies. And we're supposed
to get out.
Yeah, exactly. But the point of the family is to make workers, I would say. So do you find that, okay, I've done it again, where I'm just like asking you to discuss something I said. I'm so sorry, Kim.
Well, and then I was going to say earlier too, though, I'm not a Marxist. Like, I recognize I have a lot in common with Marxists and communists. Like, I recognize that, but it's not my lingo. So I just listen and I was on, Nick Estes is a friend of mine, and I was on his Red Nation podcast, and I was the only one who was like, I don't know how to talk like these guys, but clearly I have a lot of common ground. So I don't know what to make. I do remember the Marco Rubio thing. I'm like, being pro-family is giving people the means to support their family, like to feed, right? Like, you have to feed the ones you love. I didn't really get it, because it's so nonsensical to me. I sometimes can't even wrap my mind around where they're coming from. And also because I don't have the worker analysis in the same way. So, Well, I recognize that a lot of what I say articulates with people who engage in Marxist thought, right, and Marxist critique. And I was trained in part by Donna Haraway, so I know I'm influenced while also not having the lingo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was something else you were going to, and the octopus thing too. I did follow that. And I have been thinking a lot about the purity and contamination scenarios that have been coming up with COVID, the moralizing around being in contact with people, the assuming zero risk. There's been a strange kind of parallel between sex talk and pandemic talk for me, and the way that, and I'm convinced monogamists should not be in charge of pandemic policy.
Mm-hmm.
Heterosexual monogamists should not be in charge. They're the worst people to figure out how to get us all to relate with reducing risk, but not eliminating it, not stigmatizing relating. Like, they're just awful. And I really think it's that we have heterosexual monogamists in charge of everything, that we're so messed up around the pandemic. So I'll just put that out there.
Right. And because besides, indigenous communities, as we have seen, if any one group in America possesses an established practice of informal contact tracing for STI exposure, for example, it is promiscuous,
promiscuous relators,
shall we say, for whom sex and the erotic are inextricable aspects of how they relate, or how we relate to the world.
Yeah. But I love the octopus thing. I followed it, and I was like, ooh, Sophie's going to get in trouble over that one when I saw your original tweet, right? Because because of the human animal hierarchy and the hierarchies of life, it's really impossible for most people to think about being in relation with non-humans. And also, if we disaggregate sex into relating, I think we can think more productively about these things. So, I thought it was really I followed it closely, and I really liked it. But yeah, I see, that's dangerous territory to get into, though. Mm-hmm. Very dangerous territory. Yeah. Octopus gate, somebody said. So I know for people who didn't follow that, they're probably like, what are they talking about? I was just going to mention one brief thing. If for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about or finds it strange, Melissa Nelson writes on indigenous eco-erotics, and she has the final chapter in Joanne Barker's book. What was it called? Can't remember what it's called. Something sovereignty. Anyway, it's a Joanne Barker edited book, and Melissa Nelson has the last chapter. It's really fantastic on indigenous eco-erotics.
Critically sovereign, sorry.
Critically sovereign. Yeah, that's a lovely book. And Melissa is she talks about a story of a human stick marriage, and this woman marrying a stick. The erotic, and Audre Lorde's way of thinking about the erotic too, right? The erotic kind of way of being in relation, also with what we would call non-animate things, right? The love of building something, right? The kind of pleasure that one derives from that. So that's kind of also Melissa Nelson's in conversation with that. So I think if people are wondering about how to think about the erotic in this way that's not fetishizing sexuality and buying into a human, non-human hierarchy, she's a good place to start with the indigenous thought aspect of it as well.
So Maria, are you with us? Do you have any comments or questions?
Right.
Well, I'm extremely pleased that the erotophobia around the octopus has made its way into this conversation. But in all
I think they're going to take over the world, or octopi.
Yes. Oh, without a doubt.
So, oh my goodness. They're formidable adversaries.
Yeah, I mean, this has been such a pleasure to listen to and hear you all engage, and it's really such an emancipatory discourse and sort of politics of relating that I find is very liberating to think about in a moment of such distress and kind of the general malaise and depression of the pandemic. So to hear you converse and introduce some of these materials to us is just such a pleasure. And I really appreciate you all for your comments too. I'll make a quick plug for our last event of the week tomorrow, which Sophie will also be responding to Alyssa Battistoni tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, also on our YouTube and Facebook pages. So please join us for that. And please join me in thanking Kim, Sophie, and Marge again It's been great.
Thanks, everybody.